There's a question that has never stopped haunting humanity. Not in ancient times, not today. A question so fundamental, so raw that every civilization that ever rose from the dust has been forced to confront it sooner or later. Why do we suffer? Empires have been built trying to answer it. Philosophers have spent their entire lives searching for it. Religions have grown from the desperate need to make sense of it. And yet, more than 2,500 years ago, in the foothills of the Himalayas, in a land of red dust and monsoon rains, a single man sat down beneath a tree and refused to stand up until he found the answer. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince. He had everything the ancient world considered a mark of divine favor: a royal lineage, a magnificent palace, a wife of extraordinary beauty, a son, and the promise of a throne. He had warriors at his command, and priests who spoke of his destiny in the same breath as the gods. And he gave it all away. Not for another kingdom, not for gold or conquest. He walked away from the most powerful life a man of his era could possibly live, in search of something that no palace wall could contain and no army could protect. What he found beneath that tree in Bodh Gaya would go on to become one of the most enduring intellectual and spiritual legacies in the history of our species. Today, more than 500 million people on every continent organize their lives around his teachings, not because they were conquered, not because they had no choice, but because something in his words still speaks with uncommon precision to the reality of what it means to be human. This is the story of Siddhartha Gautama, a story of privilege and renunciation, of searching and awakening, of one man's life and the extraordinary afterlife of his ideas. It is, in many ways, the story of us all.
To understand what Siddhartha walked away from, you first need to understand the world he was born into, because it was a world nothing like the one we inhabit today, and yet in many ways disturbingly familiar. The year was approximately 563 BCE. The place, Lumbini, a garden of sal trees in the Terai lowlands near the border of what is now Nepal and India. The season was late spring, and the air was thick with the heat that precedes the monsoon, that suspended, breathless heat that makes everything feel as though it is waiting for something to break. Queen Maya Devi, wife of King Suddhodana, ruler of the Shakya clan, was traveling to her father's kingdom to give birth, as was the custom of her time. She stopped to rest beneath the trees of Lumbini, and it was there, in that garden, standing and holding the branch of a tree above her, that she gave birth to a son. The Shakya kingdom was not large by the standards of the age. It was a republic in the foothills of the great mountains to the north, a land of rice fields and mango groves, of rivers that ran silver in the dry season and brown and furious in the rains. Kapilavastu, its capital, was a city of walls and palaces, modest by the standards of the great Ganges empires to the south, but dignified and prosperous, the seat of a warrior aristocracy that prided itself on its lineage and its loyalty. King Suddhodana was, by all accounts, a careful man. When the astrologers and sages were summoned to examine the newborn prince, they made a prediction that would shape the next 3 decades of Siddhartha's life, and perhaps the next 2.5 millennia of human history. The child, they said, bore the marks of greatness. He would become one of 2 things: either the greatest king the world had ever seen, a universal monarch who would unite all peoples under a single rule, or a wandering ascetic, a sage, a man who would turn away from the world and transform it from the inside. For King Suddhodana, a man of the warrior caste whose entire identity was built on lineage, on land, on the passing of power from father to son, only one of those outcomes was acceptable. And so he built his son a golden cage. Not from malice, from love, perhaps, or from the particular blindness that comes from loving something so much that you cannot bear to see it become anything other than what you have imagined for it. He gave Siddhartha 3 palaces, one for each season of the year. He surrounded him with music, beauty, and pleasure. He ordered that no old person, no sick person, no corpse should ever be permitted within the prince's sight. Pain, disease, death, these were to remain outside the walls, invisible, as though if the prince never saw them, they might somehow not exist. Siddhartha grew up extraordinary. He was educated in the arts of war and governance. He excelled at archery and chariot racing. He married a young woman named Yashodhara, a cousin of remarkable intelligence and grace, and together they had a son they named Rahula, a name that means, with something of an irony that would only become apparent later, fetter or bond. For 29 years, it worked, or seemed to. But the walls of even the most magnificent palace cannot keep out the truth forever. And one day, or rather on 3 separate days according to the texts, Siddhartha went out into the world beyond the palace gates. He did what his father had spent decades trying to prevent. He saw. On the first excursion, he encountered an old man, bent, shaking, his body a ruin of what it had once been. Siddhartha's charioteer explained that this is what time does to all beings, without exception. On the second, a man consumed by disease lying by the road, his body racked and diminished. And again the charioteer's quiet words, "This is the nature of the body. This can happen to anyone." On the third, a corpse being tarried to the funeral grounds, the absolute irreversible finality of death made visible on a dusty road in the afternoon light. And then on a 4th journey, something different, an ascetic, a wandering holy man, walking with nothing, owning nothing, dependent on no one, and yet radiating in Siddhartha's perception a kind of undisturbed peace that the prince had never once encountered inside his 3 palaces. These 4 encounters, what the Buddhist tradition calls the 4 sights, broke something open in Siddhartha Gautama that could never be closed again. The world he had been given was not the world as it was, and the life he had been given, however golden, however cushioned, however full, could not protect him or anyone he loved from what he had just seen. That night, Siddhartha made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He walked into the room where Yashodhara slept with their newborn son. He stood there for a long time, looking at them. Then he turned and walked away. He left the palace. He left Kapilavastu. He left everything that had been built for him, that had been given to him, that had been prepared to be passed down through him. He cut off his hair, exchanged his royal robes for the simple garments of a wanderer, and disappeared into the vast, indifferent landscape of ancient India. He was 29 years old, and he had no idea what he was looking for, only that he had to find it. The India that Siddhartha Gautama walked into after leaving Kapilavastu was a world in intellectual ferment. The 6th century BCE was a remarkable era, an age historians sometimes call the Axial Age, when, across the civilized world almost simultaneously, extraordinary thinkers were emerging and reshaping the foundations of human thought. In Greece, the pre-Socratics were beginning to ask questions about the nature of reality. In China, Confucius and Lao Tzu were formulating the ethical and philosophical frameworks that would govern entire civilizations. And in India, a tradition of wandering teachers and seekers, the Sramanas, had grown into a full-blown intellectual and spiritual movement, challenging the authority of the Brahmin priests and their elaborate rituals, questioning the caste system, and searching for liberation from what they called the cycle of birth, death, and suffering. It was into this world that Siddhartha walked, barefoot, with a begging bowl, his princely past invisible to anyone who met him. He was not naive. He knew that wandering alone with only a bowl and good intentions was not enough. He sought out teachers. He found two of the most respected meditation masters of his day, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta, and he studied under both of them with the same dedication he had once brought to the arts of warfare. He mastered what they taught. He reached the meditative states they described as the highest attainments. And he was not satisfied, because the question that had driven him from the palace was still unanswered. He had learned to enter extraordinary states of mental stillness. He had learned to quiet the mind to a degree that most people could not imagine. But when he emerged from those states, the world was still as it was. Old age still waited. Sickness still waited. Death still waited. The techniques were remarkable. The liberation they promised was, in Siddhartha's estimation, incomplete. He left his teachers and joined a group of 5 ascetics, men who had taken the logic of renunciation to its extreme, who believed that the body was an obstacle to spiritual truth, and that the way to overcome it was to destroy it through deprivation. Fasting, exposure, physical mortification, these were their methods. For years, Siddhartha followed this path with the same relentless intensity he had brought to everything else. He reduced his food intake to almost nothing. His body became what the texts describe in stark terms, a skeleton covered with skin, his ribs visible like the rafters of a ruined house, his eyes sunk deep in their sockets. He nearly died. And in that near death, something clarified. He realized, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes from the very edge of existence, that the body destroyed was no more useful than the body indulged, that punishing the flesh did not liberate the mind, that he had been, in a different way, doing exactly what his father had done, trying to resolve the problem of suffering by controlling the conditions of physical existence. It didn't work. It had never worked, and it never would. He accepted a bowl of rice from a young woman named Sujata, who offered it to him by the banks of the Niranjara River. The 5 ascetics who had been his companions watched with contempt. As far as they were concerned, Siddhartha had given up. He had gone soft. They abandoned him. He ate the rice. He bathed in the river. And then he walked to a particular fig tree in a place called Bodh Gaya, a tree that tradition tells us had an unusual quality of shadow and stillness, and he sat down.
He made himself a cushion of grass. He sat facing east, and he made a vow, the kind of vow that has the weight of everything behind it, because there is nothing left to lose. He would not rise from that spot until he had understood the truth of suffering, until he had found what no palace and no teacher and no act of physical endurance had given him. What followed, the texts describe in the language of epic struggle. The forces of delusion and desire, personified in Buddhist mythology as Mara, the great tempter, launched everything they had against Siddhartha's resolve. Visions, temptations, doubts, fears, the images of everyone and everything he had left behind. The voice that says, "Enough, this is impossible, no one has ever done this, go back." He did not go back. Through the night, as the stars moved overhead and the air grew cold and the world of the Gangetic plains lay sleeping around him, Siddhartha Gautama sat with everything, every fear, every desire, every grief, every question, and did not flinch from any of it. And at dawn, as the morning star appeared on the horizon, something happened. The texts struggle to describe it, as perhaps they must, because what Siddhartha experienced in that moment was, by its very nature, beyond the capacity of ordinary language to contain. He described it in various teachings as the complete understanding of the nature of existence, of impermanence, of suffering, of the way that craving and clinging keep the mind locked in cycles of dissatisfaction, and of the path, precise, practical, available to anyone, by which that cycle can be broken. He was no longer Siddhartha Gautama. He had become the Buddha, the awakened one. He was 35 years old, and he sat for a long time, alone under the tree, in the early morning light, as the world went on around him. The question now was what to do next. The texts tell us he hesitated. He understood something so subtle, so contrary to everything the human mind habitually reaches for, that he doubted anyone would be capable of hearing it. What he had found was not a doctrine to be believed, it was not a ritual to be performed, it was not a god to be worshipped. It was a way of seeing, and seeing it required a kind of inner stillness that the noise of ordinary desire makes almost impossibly difficult. But he went anyway.
The Buddha walked north from Bodh Gaya. He walked to a place called Sarnath, near the ancient city of Varanasi, where the sacred Ganges makes its great bend northward before turning south again. And there, in a deer park on the outskirts of the city, he found the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him, the men who had watched him accept Sujata's rice and concluded that he had failed. He sat with them. He spoke. What he said in that first sermon, what the Buddhist tradition calls the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, was neither complicated nor mystical. It was, in its structure, almost clinical. He described 4 observations about the nature of human experience that he called the 4 noble truths. The first, that life, as ordinarily lived, is characterized by dukkha, a Pali word usually translated as suffering, but which carries a more precise meaning, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence, the way that everything we reach for eventually disappoints, changes, or disappears. The second, that this unsatisfactoriness has a cause, tanha, craving, the habitual grasping of the mind toward pleasure and away from pain, the constant seeking of a stable satisfaction that, by the nature of impermanence, can never quite arrive. The third, that this craving can cease, that liberation from the cycle of dissatisfaction is not a theoretical possibility, but an actual, achievable state. And the fourth, that there is a path, 8 specific dimensions of mental and ethical training, right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, that together constitute what he called the middle way, not the indulgence of the palace, not the mortification of the ascetic, but a precise and practical path of cultivation available to any human being willing to walk it. The 5 ascetics listened, and something in what they heard, perhaps the directness of it, perhaps the quality of the man who was speaking, perhaps simply the recognition that this was not theory, but lived reality, convinced them. They became the Buddha's first students, the first members of what would eventually become one of the oldest continuously existing institutions in human history, the Buddhist monastic community, the Sangha. For the next 45 years, the Buddha walked. He walked the roads and river valleys of the Gangetic Plains, the same ancient landscape of mango groves and dust and monsoon skies where he had grown up, now seen through entirely different eyes. He taught in cities and villages, in royal courts, and in the open air beneath trees. He spoke to merchants and farmers, to Brahmins, and to people considered untouchable by the rigid hierarchy of the caste system. In a society built on the inherited privilege of birth, he taught that awakening was available to anyone, regardless of caste, regardless of sex, regardless of the circumstances of their origin. This was, in the context of his time, a radical position, revolutionary even.
The religious establishment of ancient India, the Brahmin priests who controlled access to the sacred texts and charged handsomely for the rituals they performed, had no interest in a teaching that said liberation did not require their mediation.
The caste system, which kept hundreds of thousands of people locked in roles determined by the accident of birth, had no use for a philosophy that regarded it as morally irrelevant. But the Buddha's teachings spread anyway, because it answered something real. He established monastic communities. He created the first rules for the governance of religious institutions in recorded history. He admitted women into the order, another act of radical egalitarianism in an era when women's spiritual status was, at best, an afterthought in most religious traditions. His cousin Ananda, who would become his closest attendant for 25 years, was one of the advocates for this inclusion. Kings sought his counsel. The wealthy offered their parks and gardens as sites for the monasteries that grew up around his teaching. The poor offered food and respect. And slowly, over those 45 years, a network of communities and practices and teachings spread across northern India, not through conquest, not through coercion, not through the promise of worldly reward, but through the simple, quietly radical proposition that the source of human suffering was to be found inside the human mind, and that the same mind that created the problem contained the resources necessary to resolve it. He died at the age of 80 in a small town called Kushinagar, a place so modest that one of his disciples, as they approached it, reportedly expressed surprise that the teacher would choose such an undistinguished setting for his final moments. The Buddha, with characteristic composure, suggested that the significance of a place is not determined by its size. He had eaten a meal offered by a blacksmith named Kunda, a meal that, according to the texts, contained something that caused severe illness. He knew, as he lay down beneath 2 sal trees with their white blossoms opening above him in warm night air, that he was dying. He asked that Kunda not be made to feel guilty. He gave his final instructions. His last words, preserved across multiple texts with a consistency that suggests they were remembered with particular care, were addressed to his assembled students. All conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. Not a command to worship, not a request for rituals, not a claim to divine authority, an invitation to effort, a reminder that the work was theirs to do. And then he was gone. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of ideas. 2 centuries after his death, one of the most powerful rulers the ancient world had ever produced, Ashoka, emperor of the Maurya dynasty, a man whose armies had just fought one of the bloodiest wars in ancient Indian history, stood on the battlefield of Kalinga and looked at what he had done. More than 100,000 soldiers lay dead. Hundreds of thousands more had been displaced. The victory was complete and utterly devastating. According to his own inscriptions, carved on pillars and rock faces across his vast empire, some of which survive to this day, Ashoka was consumed by remorse. He turned to the teachings of the Buddha. And then he did something that no conqueror in recorded history had done before. He renounced conquest. He declared that henceforth the only victory worth seeking was the victory of Dharma, of righteous conduct, of compassion, of non-violence. He sent missionaries to Sri Lanka, to Central Asia, to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West. He had his edicts inscribed in multiple languages so that the peoples of his empire and beyond it could understand his intentions. He ordered the construction of hospitals for humans and animals. He planted trees along the roads. He built rest houses for travelers. The wheel he placed on his pillars, the Dharma Chakra, the wheel of the teaching, is today at the center of the flag of the Republic of India.
His lion capital stands as that nation's official emblem. More than 2,000 years later, the echoes of one man's conversion to another man's teaching still shape the political identity of one of the largest nations on earth. Buddhism traveled. It went to Sri Lanka, where it arrived by the 3rd century BCE and has never left. It went to Southeast Asia, where the great empires of Cambodia and Thailand and Burma would build their identity around it. It went to China, where it merged with local traditions and created forms of practice that would eventually reach Japan and Korea. It went to Tibet, where it became the foundation of an extraordinary intellectual and artistic civilization. And in the 20th century, it traveled to the West, carried first by scholars, then by practitioners, then by the growing recognition that its insights about the workings of the mind had something to say to the psychological crises of modern life. Today, mindfulness, one of the 8 dimensions of the path the Buddha described in that deer park in Sarnath, is practiced in hospitals and schools and corporate boardrooms. Neuroscientists study what happens in the brains of experienced meditators. Psychotherapists incorporate Buddhist concepts into their clinical frameworks. And in monasteries from Myanmar to Minnesota, men and women sit in silence, following the breath, watching the movements of the mind, doing exactly what a prince from the Shakya clan did beneath a sacred fig tree 2,500 years ago. Why does it last? Perhaps because what the Buddha diagnosed was not a problem unique to 6th century BCE India. It was not a problem of a particular culture, a particular class, a particular historical moment. It was the problem of being conscious in a world that is always changing, the fundamental human difficulty of wanting things to stay as they are when nothing ever does, of building identity around what is impermanent, of seeking a stable happiness in circumstances that are by nature unstable. He did not promise a God who would fix it. He did not promise a paradise after death. He did not offer a doctrine to be believed on the authority of scripture or tradition. He offered instead an invitation to look carefully, honestly, without flinching, at the nature of experience itself. And he offered a method, practical, teachable, available. That invitation has not expired. The sal trees at Kushinagar are gone. The palaces of Kapilavastu have returned to the dust from which they rose. The Shakya clan exists today only in history books and in the memory of a faith that carries his name forward. But the question he sat down with beneath the Bodhi tree, the question of why we suffer and whether it is possible to be free, that question is as alive today as it was on the night he first asked it. And somewhere in that fact, in the stubborn, irrational persistence of a question that refuses to go unanswered, perhaps we can find one answer to the question this documentary began with. Why are his teachings still followed 2,500 years later? Because the human condition has not changed, because suffering has not been abolished by technology or prosperity or the passage of time, because the mind that creates the problem is still the mind we all inhabit every day without exception. And because in the long history of those who have tried to say something true and useful about that condition, very few have done it with the precision, the compassion, and the enduring relevance of a prince who walked away from a throne to sit under a tree and look at the truth until it looked back.
If you have stayed with us until this moment, we owe you our deepest gratitude. You chose, in a world overflowing with noise and distraction, to spend this time with a story that is more than 2,500 years old, and that is anything but a small thing. What Siddhartha Gautama understood beneath that tree was not reserved for monks or mystics. It was for anyone willing to look honestly at the nature of their own experience. It was for you.
it has always been for you. We will leave you with his final words, because no closing we could write would be more fitting than the ones he chose for himself. Work out your salvation with diligence. If this documentary moved something in you, a question, a memory, a recognition, we want to hear it. The comments section below is where this conversation continues. What surprised you most about his story? What resonates with your own life? What do you wish you had known sooner? And if you believe someone else deserves to hear this story, share it, because that too is a form of what the Buddha spent 45 years doing, walking from one person to the next and saying, there is something worth knowing, and it is available to you. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss a new documentary. Each week, we return to the ancient world and bring back stories that still have something to say to the present one. The next video is waiting for you, and we promise the best is still to come.